Have you ever been in a game where you find yourself completely and totally lost? Not sure exactly where you are, which is the right direction to go in. All around you, potential bad choices that could lead to inconvenience, or much worse. Some people fear the unknown more than anything else, and fear not knowing where they are, how to get back to some place that they considered safe. This is a very real concern, not just in the scope of the game, but sometimes the game itself may feel like you are lost, without any hope of getting back to someplace safe and familiar. Today we're going to talk about this when we bring up vectors in this level of the Lair of OmnusI. A new season brought forth by a new year. What new dangers, what new knowledges, what discoveries, and what stories will we uncover? For all of these and more can be found here at the Lair of OmnusI in this, our third season. As we start this level, there's a term that you're going to need to be familiar with because I'm going to be using it again and again. It's a term from geometry called vector. A vector is a measurement of direction and intensity. So, when measuring, for instance, speed, the direction is, of course, the course traveled. The intensity is the actual speed measured in how long it takes to get from one point to another. So miles per hour, for instance, or kilometers per hour, or some such. Now, that's very, very useful, obviously, in anything involving motion and measurement. But taken out of its geographical or geometrical context, or sometimes geographical too, but you know. At any rate, plate tectonics and all that, weather, yeah. Vectors figure into our life all over the place. Because our lives are full of motion. Things happen for a purpose. Events unfold before us. People travel from place to place. There are vectors. And importantly, a game should also have a vector. For many games, it's fairly simple. You want to win, so your vector is to do the thing that is required to win. Get the most money, bankrupt your opponents, conquer all the pieces, capture the king, what have you. It all leads to a point. Now, a role-playing game is much more open-ended, potentially. Even a sandbox game, though, needs vectors in order to remain interesting and to ensnare the attentions of the players. You don't necessarily need but one vector, but many can be employed at the same time, vying for the attentions of the players. But what isn't a vector? Simply put, anything in a game that directs action is a potential vector. And for that purpose, I would example, try that again. A vector in a role-playing game is anything that invites the players to act, or causes, or is the influencer to action. So, a tip whispered to a group in a tavern may be a vector. Perhaps a treasure map may be another kind of vector. Perhaps an angry horde of villains moving to attack is a certain kind of vector, certainly a more immediate one. Vectors can surround the players at all times. Our lives are filled with them, and it makes sense that the player characters' lives are going to be full of vectors. And a good player build involves several vectors that tie their character and spur their actions. If you've played 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, you know that the characters now come with some pre-built vectors that were lacking in earlier editions. The idea that they have a goal gives them a vector, reason to do something when immediate adventure isn't in the offing, something they can work towards. They have a bond, something they care about, something that can be tugged or acted upon to spur the player to care about something, to act, hopefully. Flaws, which may impel the characters to act in a negative fashion, working against their own common interest, but, again, keeping within the framework of the character. These can be very, very useful. Backgrounds in general can be full of vectors. One of the most terrible backgrounds for vectors is one where the player neatly ties up all of their loose ends in the background. I had a family, but they all died. I had an estate, it burned to the ground. I had a sister, I rescued my sister, she got married, and then everybody died. There's nothing to work with there. There's no vector. There's nothing to spur the character forward if the character doesn't want to be led by that. Now, sure, certainly, you could say that the character is impelled to declare eternal war against the creatures that burned down their estate or led to the deaths of their family. Certainly, you can do that. So, for instance, if the character is that driven, then a whispered word that there's a presence of, for instance, if, say, goblins did it, common fodder. If goblins did it, a whispered word that there are goblins in this particular dungeon may spur that character lusting for revenge to go to that dungeon. There's a vector there. But if the character doesn't want to, they're like, I'm tired of goblins. I've already dealt with all the goblins I feel I need to. There's nothing to compel them anymore. There's no vector left in their background. Which can be kind of sad, honestly. The person is that unattached to things generally leads to, well, if you want to know where murder hobos come from, it's because they don't have attachments. And that kind of thing just leads to, well, just do whatever feels good at the time. Now, there's a couple of principles involved when using vectors. One of the most common ones for game masters are hooks. That is, something that is introduced to the players that inspire the player themselves to want their character to pursue the activity. Maybe it's tweaking on one of those background traits. Maybe it's something that tugs at a particular bond or a flaw or something that causes the character to want to indulge in that. A good hook is one that is interesting to the player and spurs them to move forward and drive their character to pursue that particular angle. In a complex game, most characters have numerous hooks dangling in front of them. It's only realistic, honestly. Our lives are terribly complicated, and why should the lives of our characters necessarily be much less so? But, quite honestly, if you are telling a story and there is just one compelling plot always hanging in front of the player characters, that's still a hook. It's just a massive fish hook that may already have them and have negative consequences for not pursuing that particular hook, especially if they're saving the world or something. Kind of have to follow that line. But hooks don't have to necessarily be that obvious. They don't necessarily have to be something that is going to threaten the players if they don't follow them. The whole idea of a sandbox, for instance, is that you can leave all of these hooks lying around and the pursuers will be going after the ones that most speak to them at the moment. So your player characters may chase individual hooks at different times. That's kind of the point of a sandbox, is you let the players choose their direction, giving them the element of free choice and free will. That way all the bad things are their fault, right? Well, not necessarily. But the whole idea of a hook is that it doesn't take away from the free will of a character. They can pursue it or not, even if there are negative consequences. But it's a little bit different than railroading, where you are actively dragging them along with the threat of a plot hammer smashing them, or just outright taking away the free will, which for some people is very negative as an experience. The idea of a hook is more in line to fishing, where you dangle the bait with the hook, hoping that the players bite, and then you reel them in. The hook is the actual piece of bait that you use and dangle in front of the players that draws them. But then, in fishing, there's more than just a hook, isn't there? There's also a line. When you have the hook, once they nibble, the line carries them along on the particular course that you're looking for, be it a side quest, something that is there for the players to do that isn't necessarily tied to a larger theme within the storyline. This can allow the players to feel like there's more to the world than just the path in front of them. It serves to enrich the world around them and let them see and perhaps even view other perspectives in the world to make it feel more real, understanding there are more people than just their day-to-day experiences. Side quests can be invaluable for letting players think like their characters and feel like they have that element of choice, like they have the ability to go and pursue their interests rather than just what seems to be in front of them at all times. And a line is valuable in building your lore, in giving motivations to those other faceless people outside of the purview of the main storyline as you might intend. But in a game that is more of a sandbox, then mostly the world is full of hooks and lines. So, when the players pursue, the line is there to lead them to whatever you're going to. Maybe it's a small little dungeon setting, maybe it's a particular building, maybe it's a choice encounter that you wish to lead them to. The sinker is the final goal, what they encounter when they pursue that line. It is something that is a bit more of a commitment, but it's not something that throws itself out at the characters. For instance, if the players find out about the existence of a notorious band of brigands. Now, the Game Master has an opportunity as the players travel to have this band of brigands ambush them and attack them. That's actually taking the sinker and dropping it on the fish. But if you want to make the players feel like they are more in command of the situation and have license over what they're doing, then letting them know that there's this infamous band, perhaps the hook is a bounty that's on their heads. The players need the money. Aha! There you go. The players now have their characters interested. They're following up. They're learning about this group, their weaknesses, their methods of operation. Then, their location, where they can be found. The line has been strung. Now the players form a course of action, how they're going to deal with this particular band. The ball is in their court. Unless, of course, they're too transparent and the group finds out about this group of heroes that's coming to smite them, and then they might have a much different reception. But, again, that's within the control of the players, potentially. And the sinker, the confrontation, the big battle at, say, the band's headquarters, or an ambush set up by the players to get them when they're most vulnerable, depending on how far thinking your players are or what you allow. So, that's a classic example of hook, line, and sinker. And this is something that can be employed again and again and again in the course of a campaign. It's almost natural. It's the way that we kind of expect these things to happen. In a movie, you can see the opening acts as the hook. It's what gets the players, the audience, interested and justifies the characters getting involved in the storyline. In Star Wars, Luke Skywalker stumbles across some droids by chance, and all of a sudden he finds a message that is a hook that draws him for the rest of his life on the course he's going to follow. The line is meeting Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then getting into the rebellion, and then meeting Yoda, and so on and so forth. The sinker, of course, is whatever you thought that the final result had to be. The confrontation with Vader in Bespin, the confrontation with the Emperor and Vader in the second Death Star. maybe any of those could have been seen as the sinker for that. But more than likely, each element would be the sinker. For example, the blowing up the first Death Star would have been how you get to that point. And then another line, another hook, another sinker, etc. Life is a series of such things, are they not? Although far too often in real life, they don't get fully resolved. Sad but true. At least in an adventure, you have that fantasy of being able to find something, pursue it to its conclusion, and then finish it. So, hooks, lines, and sinkers are important vectors in role-playing games, potentially. I mean, it's just as useful in any form of media, but role-playing games, it's something that often requires special thought. The idea that some people have going into a sandbox is that, yeah, the players can go and pursue anything they're interested in. But if you don't have vectors, if you don't have hooks that interest them, then it could just be a lengthy day trip that doesn't really amount to anything of any great amount. I've made this mistake myself. I one time said, all right, here's the fantasy city of Greyhawk. Have fun. And the player's like, okay, I'm going to go in here. I role-played out the scenario. Okay, I'm going to go over here, and we role-played out a scenario. And it didn't go anywhere. Surprise! Yes, you have a city with thousands of people living in it. You have active thieves guilds, assassins guilds. You have a college of magic, which is a big tower with lightning bolts shooting, or no, pyramid, with lightning bolts shooting out of the spire. You have temples but if you don't have vectors, if you don't have elements to snare the players, to draw their attention and direct their action, it's a big empty box. And for some people, that's all right, but for most people, they prefer things to do in that box. So vectors become very, very important very quickly. Now, any adventure that you have, any pre-made adventure is going to have, of course, a rather sizable hook, depending on how railroady the adventure is. Most of them are fairly linear. The hook is going to be something that is guaranteed to snare the players. And if they choose not to bite on that hook, the game is over. If they go into the town of Hammerfast and they find out that the town is gripped in an eternal winter and the curse has been determined to come from the ruined castle outside of town, and the players go, nope, we're leaving. You aren't running the adventure then, are you? Unless you use heavier duty bait. They get arrested and told that they will be executed if they don't go and stop the curse that's in the castle. Goodbye agency, goodbye player choice, but now you're running the adventure. That's kind of how it goes. The hook usually has to be pretty darn compelling. Sometimes it's for money. Let's face it, a lot of adventurers are motivated by greed or want. And it works, certainly, it's traditional. And that is an element. So a lot of players are for hire, or they have a goal which requires money. Building a temple, for instance, helping the poor, advancing their studies. Personal development is usually pretty high, but also getting the kind of tools around them that they need, be it magic, excellent gear, something they have to have crafted or requires exotic materials. Money is a good motivator. It's a good hook. It's the start of that vector. And it can provide the amount of magnitude. A sizable enough bounty may sway the players to pay extra attention to that particular goal and pursue it beyond all others. I'm reminded of the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons Adventure Path Dragon Heist. Dragon, in this case, refers to the coinage of the city of Waterdeep. Gold pieces are called dragons. And the players are pursuing a bounty of 500,000 dragons. That is 500,000 gold pieces for low-level characters. It's an unheard of sum. It's something that could very easily ensnare their complete attention going on this treasure hunt with all the other scum in Waterdeep going after it, for the chance at getting ridiculously wealthy. Ridiculously wealthy. The magnitude is off the charts for most people, to the point where many of the people are going to be playing for keeps. This is a massive hook. It's not subtle. The promise of that much wealth is not subtle at all. And, you know, even if you're the kind of player who's like, well, my character really isn't motivated by money, but anything that you're motivated for almost certainly can be helped at the very least by being ridiculously wealthy. So it's a very, very strong spur for your players. It is an excellent hook. Then the line comes forward. How do they pursue it and who do they pursue against? That's your line. The sinker, of course, would be at the end of the story, although there are going to be numerous little knots in the line that they will have to resolve. It's kind of how those adventure paths go. Now, that is certainly a temptation for any game master who's kind of coming up with their own idea, to just throw lots of hooks all over the place, have complicated, tangled skeins of line everywhere. And that's fine, especially if you remember that different ones are going to have different magnitudes to different players. Some things will be overwhelmingly attractive. For example, saving the world might be, if the danger is very real, the players might find themselves caring enough to want to go and save the world. Certainly another popular hook. But if you're not going to do the end of the world, then oftentimes the magnitude of the hooks is going to be implied within the characters themselves, their goals, their bonds, what they want. These are the kind of ways that you can guide the characters through the encounters that you're interested in, while still leaving out the possibility that they could go and pursue their own different things off of who knows what. Sometimes an errant comment that you make, and this has happened to me numerous times, an errant comment that you make inspires characters' fascination to the point of obsession. If you mention that there's a certain laughing, green-eyed barmaid in this ramshackle fisherman's little town, and they can't understand why everybody else in town is completely dejected and run down. The city is dirt poor. People scrape their coppers together. There's almost no gold ever seen in this place. Occasionally, if you're doing well, you get a couple of silvers, but that's about it. But there's this one laughing barmaid. She puts up with adventurers' nonsense with style. She's really good at getting strangers to drink more. She's always very courteous. You give her a great accent. She's not intended to be a major character, but the players might just pinpoint on her. To them, she sticks out like a sore thumb, and you were just trying to make an interesting character, because you didn't want everybody to be a gloomy fisherman, barely talking to anybody else, laconic and brooding. Nope, you made her a peppy barmaid, and she just does her best to try to keep people coming in and spending what money is in the town here. If it means, that it's her presence and her perkiness, you don't even need to tie anything, any sordid secrets or anything for her or anything like that. You might not have intended for her to be a vector. But in a sandbox or in a game where the players are used to having a lot of choice, they may make that their own vector. They may go, wow. There may be the character who is obsessed with wooing said maid. There may be some who are convinced that she is a contact in a thieves' guild. There may be some who are absolutely positive that she is divinely backed to try to inspire and bring up the spirits of the people who are in this town as the one bead of light that they can find. Certainly, she has a secret. Now, as a game master, you see all of this unfolding. Do you change things on the fly? Give her a secret? Give something to her to suddenly justify the player's attentions? Or you just let it wither? It's like, no, she really has no secret. If you really try to woo her, well, she's a living creature. She might be charmed or flattered, but she might have very strong convictions and be like, no, just on the clock, I'm working, so I don't have time for any of that. Oh, you want to meet me after work? Well, there's not much time in my day for that, but in 2 days' time I have a day that I have a leave on, so perhaps if you're still in town in 2 days. Things like that. But, you're the game master, and you want to keep them interested. If they're here in this little miserable town, and your great hook that you actually have in this town is, for instance, some sort of killer nautical creature that's very shortly going to be scaring all of the fishermen in, smashing a couple of their ships, killing a few fishermen. The rest of them are terrified. Here's the player's chance to come in and save the day. But they care about this barmaid more than anything. Well, what do you do? The answer is there's no right answer. Obviously, you can just stick to things the way you are. If this upcoming adventure is very compelling and you still want to go with it, you could just have them chatter with her a little bit, but just kind of move on. But some game masters will pounce on that like a starving squirrel on the last nut on earth. They will all of a sudden unfold that, yes, she is a divine soul and that she is capable of, she has the gift of healing, and she is actually doing everything she can to lift the spirits and probably save some of these people from their alcoholic depressions that is their only release, really, from the drudgery of their life and the crippling poverty they experience. Perhaps. Or perhaps she is a contact with the Thieves Guild and she's not really good at blending, per se. But at the same time, she's not from this town, and its effects haven't gotten to her yet. So she's very much a fish out of water. Or maybe she could be a young wizard who is researching magical nautical life. And while she's here, she is trying to learn from the locals. So she's taken a cover and gotten this job. And she has some magical talents which could be very useful to the party. I just came up with those things off the spur of the moment. I'm sure you can come up with something pretty interesting yourself. I always thought one of the most interesting characters in Dungeons & Dragons literature was Tika Whalen from Dragonlance. She's a barmaid. She is fiery. She has a temper. But she is used to a tavern environment. She's used to people in Odix, trying to accost her and just spinning out and making sure they still get their drinks and make sure she gets her tips. And if she needs to, she knows how to use that frying pan upside somebody's skull to settle problems. But she's savvy enough, she even puts up with when the Draconians occupy the city, managing these strange evil creatures that are in her town, but she still manages, although it's rough. The switch for her to become an adventuress following along with the party, with Caraman and Raceland and Tanis and Flint and all those great characters, is a complete switch. She's a normal person who suddenly becomes a fighter, learning her trade along with Caraman. He tries to teach her the things she's going to need to know to defend herself, and while she never, through the first few books, she doesn't really grasp the high arts of fighting, she's still effective because she's tough and she's spunky. She's got a lot of heart. So she gets hurt from time to time. She eventually gets shown how to wear armor and stuff. And there's a lot of cute moments as Caraman is very much entwined with her romantically and unlocking parts of himself, the big lug. Her transformation into an adventuress is not a neat one. It's very complex because she gets frustrated and oftentimes she just starts bludgeoning things in a fight, fighting without finesse, but with a lot of passion, and she experiences fear. It's fascinating. All of the different vectors that pluck a normal person out to do something like adventuring is crazy. But those were, of course, extreme times. So vectors are very important in a game. And when you're creating a game, including, for instance, an actual role-playing game, a full role-playing game, most of the best ones have vectors built in. For instance, take basic fantasy role-playing, the basic fantasy role-playing game. It is designed to be a kind of a universal platform. It's going to invite people to add their own vectors into their games, whether they take a module, whether they create their own. You provide the vectors, we just provide the system for you. Something like Werewolf the Apocalypse, however, full of vectors. You have all the politics of the different tribes of the Garou, the werewolves themselves. You have different elements within your character that can invite storylines to open up. You have your rage, which, for somebody who is possessed by their rage, they have a lot of rage, and this may spring all kinds of side stories as they accidentally slip and savage somebody, and now the group has to worry about hiding that. Their gnosis, their spiritual aspect, invites them to step off into the Umbra and experience the spirit world and all of that can be. As the Guru, they are kind of princes of the material world, but in the spirit world, they're very much supplicants and adventurers, not necessarily the masters anymore. They have to dance to the tune of spirits that they've got alliances with and learn their mastery and their craft almost over again, understanding that world. Those are built into the game, and in a lot of really good games, those kind of vectors come pre-baked so that a player can go, okay, I'd like to play Shadowrun. Immediately you know half of the vectors. You know about megacorporations. You know about the street life. You know about the conflicts between the races. You know about the march towards technology and invasiveness of cyberware, as some people see that as their way out of abject poverty or to give them the edge they need. For some people, it's evil and abhorrent, and they want it at arm's length. There's a lot of vectors that are pre-soaked into that world, some of which take place in the game itself, through the mechanisms of the game, in terms of your astral skills or your hacking abilities and stuff like that. But in terms of designing your own adventure, vectors become supremely important. Now, not all vectors, of course, have to have equal weight. I've talked about that. Magnitude is very important. And sometimes, magnitude can be very important. If you're going to throw, for instance, red herrings at the players that might distract their attention, a weaker magnitude might be the clue they get that maybe this is not something they need to be pursuing. But the fact that it's there means the players have the opportunity to go off in other areas, and possibly not the correct or true way, and they'll have to find their way back somehow. But understanding that if you dangle hooks, there's a chance the players might find them to be compelling enough to pursue them. You know, it's something that you should be thinking about when you design adventures, or when you think about how to integrate characters into an adventure you want to run. That becomes very important. And the hook, line, sinker approach is just very, very useful. Understanding what an end goal is for anything that you design is important. To wrap up, I would like to, however, put out a shout out to my man Anton Chekhov, Russian playwright, and of course his principle of Chekhov's gun. If you're not familiar with it, Chekhov's gun is basically the idea that if there's a gun on a wall in a scene, that gun has to be fired. Otherwise, there was no point for it, and it shouldn't have ever been there. It's just a distraction away from what's going to happen. Likewise, if we as game masters pile all of these hooks at players, and we throw in things, but we don't intend to do anything with it, and the players find a hook that we never really intended, that idea of that barmaid could be really distracting if the story that you had was really compelling. And the idea of making hooks on the fly might be unsatisfying to some. But the idea of putting out only the hooks that you intend to use in a given scenario can be very, very important. For people who love just making stuff up on the fly and throwing lots of things out, sometimes it's a discipline to limit yourself and constrict the player's options so they're not left grasping at straws that you never really had anything connected to. So the principle of Chekhov's gun, of course, is to limit your hooks to just what you intend to let the players follow up on. And I think that can be very, very useful to people who love throwing out all of the variety and wonder of their world, but leave all these possibilities for the players to explore if they're not sure what the players are going to be inclined to actually pursue. The better you know your players, the easier it is to narrow that scope. But honestly, I find that when you are playing with complete strangers, really concentrating on narrowing the scope becomes very important. The last example I'll use for that is my adventure that I came up with I was running GURPS at GameholeCon, and it was called Through the Portal of Fire. I intentionally knew that I was going to run this one-shot 4-hour con game, and I didn't want to leave the players just, in a town with no vectors. So I started the adventure. They were fighting the big bad evil guy to start up. They had their pre-generated characters. Everybody was already familiar with GURPS, which was nice. But I was ready in case they didn't. And they were fighting the big bad evil guy, and then the bad guy got knocked through his portal of fire. Poof. And that was the end of the initial encounter. They're like, cool, let's shut down the portal and we win. They couldn't. So the vector came, they had to pursue the big bad evil guy through the portal of fire. There was no real option. I didn't give them all the options in the world at that point. They knew they had to finish it. And it was able to be confirmed by the magic using character of the party that he wasn't gone yet. And he could come back stronger than ever if you didn't follow him. And that, of course, unfolded the next scene, which was in a Southern California high school. Magic suddenly doesn't work so well. It's dampened in the low magic setting of real Earth. And because of a time dilation, the big bad evil guy had already been on Earth for 2 weeks, taking on a job as the janitor in the school and setting it up so that he could enact his necromancy and starting to turn the students into zombies. So it became a zombie storyline. It was, I enjoyed it. Eventually they found him because he was too engrossed in the culture. They found him in the janitor's room down below the school in the basement watching classic He-Man and Masters of the Universe episodes. He really felt Skeletor. It was fun. But notice, they went through the portal. There's the school in front of them. There's a cordon of police around because they're dealing with the shambling zombie issue. And they're told, hey, you crazy cosplayers, you can't go in there. Believe it or not, there seems like there's actual zombies in there, and they immediately knew what they had to do. So while I did allow them possibly to look around and maybe, try to experiment, and maybe try to steal a gun or something, the story unfolded as I intended because that was their goal. They didn't want to go walking around in this strange world where their magic wasn't working very well. Instead, they had to deal with all these people with their strange clothes and their strange, tiny little devices and things like that, and ended up as the fish out of water. It was a little trite, but it was fun. We had a good time with it. So that's my own experience. Hopefully, this helps you to think about in the future, vectors that you might be able to use, leaving out vectors that just distract, that may be more trouble than they're worth, and understanding that all of these various things that you put in might be somebody's triggering point, the initial point for their vector, and they might determine the magnitude involved. So, all right, thank you for joining me for this. I think after all of this and hearing me talk about something like that, you might be ready for a little treasure, huh? With all this talk about vectors, it kind of reminds me that some things themselves represent a vector. Candles, for instance. A candle is a fairly linear vector. You light it, the wick burns, and the wax melts, and that's how they work. And along the way, it creates a steady amount of light and heat and, melted wax, a little bit of smoke. So it's a fairly understandable vector and predictable. That's why we've been using candles for a very, very long time. But some candles have more of a vector than that. For instance, this one. Something I found fell off the back of a truck sale, I suspect. But it's a very nice molded candle. The castle on a rocky outcropping is pretty cool. 2 wicks for the 2 towers. But this is a dual vector item. Obviously, can create light and heat. I could light these wicks and I could watch this all melt. I'm kind of curious what happens as the wicks burn down. Do they meet in the middle? I'm not sure. I half want to do it. But at the same time, I love this candle because I can occasionally reference this or get ideas for some sort of a mountaintop castle. The design element is kind of nice. It is evocative if I put it somewhere. It's, a castle has a certain appeal to it, a certain structural, at least for me. I love castles. I think castles are amazing architectural accomplishments. And, we've been doing it for so long, making castles and such. But this one, with all the arches and little elements within, it's not, very distinct, but that's fine. It does what it needs to do. And you can even see that it's got the trail along the edge, the roadway leading up to it, and then the stairs going up to the main gates. This would be hell to try to take. This would be absolutely, absolutely insane to try to capture this castle. We'd be sieging it. A direct frontal assault is nigh impossible. Anybody on top of the outer wall and the upper towers would just absolutely ruin anybody standing in front of that gate. So this would be one very much that you would end up having to siege. You would have to stop people from going in and out, supplies from going in and out, and starve them out, basically, until they surrender. Or can't defend themselves anymore, and then you basically just have to go in, scale up a wall or two, and get into the castle, open up the gates, and that Bob's your uncle. But I always love things that are both functional. If I ever need a candle, I've got candles, and at the same time convey something. In this case, a really cool, exotic castle. So oftentimes, this is something to me that spurs my idea of giving out treasure and magical items, is that I think the best magical items are one that are themselves a vector. Something that has a story that might cause the players to be interested. A +1 sword is so much less interesting than a sword that is +1 because it was treated by alchemical processes in the ancient empire of Phryne. And these were mass-produced by the master alchemists who were in war with the arcane emirate, who supplied their troops with magical weapons and the like, but the alchemists did just as well with the same thing, and they basically mass-produced these things. So there's a storyline to it. And people might go, well, if the Phryne Empire had all these alchemical magical weapons, maybe they had more and cooler things, and maybe we can go looking up those Phryne elements and maybe find a cache or a stronghold of potent alchemically crafted weapons from back in the day. Even though it's a fairly weak hook, and not a lot of players are going to look into the backstory of every +1 item, at least having an idea of that and something that the players can bite into and maybe go along can make your world seem that much richer. Can sometimes help your players to find side quests and elements that they themselves might be interested in pursuing. So I generally think that something like that is a good thing. Now, if this were a magical item right here, which it might be, what would you do with it? Obviously, you would think to activate it, lighting it. 3rd edition had in their, what was it? Tome and Blood, I think it was. They had a candle wizard. Basically, they would turn the effects of their potions and scrolls into candles. They would light them. It would take a little bit longer, but anybody can light a candle. And then you... kind of cool. So this probably has some sort of a magical effect. And it is a bit substantial. So if you've got it, and say you're an adventurer, you'd want to protect it. You want to put it, nestle it deep in your backpack where it's not going to get beaten up too much. But what would happen if you lit this? Tell you what, I'm giving you this candle to put on your character sheet. If you ever play a game with me, and you note that your character has one of these, well, I guess we'll find out together, eh? No, I know what it does, but you don't. So lighting this particular candle could be something very interesting, and maybe lighting one of these towers might be interesting. Lighting both of them might be a real kick. Maybe it'll save you in that one clutch time. Who knows? So make sure you write that on your character sheet, as well as the 15 lair points that you've so richly earned by joining me today. So, been a pretty successful lair episode, I think. This level is pretty well cleared. I think we picked it pretty well. So thank you once more for joining me. I'm OmnusI, and as always, you are very welcome here in my lair. Until next time, keep your dice ready. Roll some dice, play some games, have some fun, stay safe out there. And I will see you next time here at the Lair of OmnusI. Farewell.